If you ever find yourself trapped in a blizzard, pray the wrong door still opens. Clara Whitmore would remember those words later. Right now, she could barely remember how to feel her hands. Snow struck her face so hard it almost felt alive, sharp wind clawing through layers of worn wool like winter itself had decided she no longer belonged outside. The mountain road had disappeared nearly 30 minutes ago. Maybe longer. Time moved strangely when survival became the only thing left to think about. 1 second stretched forever. Every breath hurt. Every step felt uncertain. Clara tightened trembling fingers around the edge of her coat, though she could barely feel the fabric anymore. Wonderful. Because apparently helping strangers in neighboring villages came with the exciting reward of freezing to death halfway home. The basket she carried hours earlier was long gone now, abandoned somewhere behind her beneath endless white. Not that soup deliveries mattered much when fingers stopped moving properly. Or when visibility dropped so low the world looked swallowed whole. She had left Briar Hollow before sunrise. That had been the plan anyway. Help old Mrs. Bennet through another fever spell, collect modest payment, return before the weather changed. Simple. Manageable. Normal. Except Winter and Thornwood Pack rarely cared about plans. By noon the sky darkened strangely. By afternoon, snow came hard enough to swallow roads entirely. And now? Now Clara could barely tell earth from sky. Wind screamed through the mountain pass, carrying cold sharp enough to settle deep inside bone. Her boots slipped against frozen stone hidden beneath fresh snow. She caught herself against a dead tree branch, chest rising too quickly. Cold air burned her lungs. Somewhere far in the distance came the sound of wolves. Not close. Not dangerous exactly. Yet close enough to remind her how very alone she stood. Her village sat at least 6 miles away now. Maybe more. Walking another mile felt impossible. Walking 6 felt cruel. Clara stopped moving for one dangerous second, pressing frozen fingers briefly against her face. Her cheeks ached. Eyelashes carried tiny pieces of ice. Even breathing hurt differently now. Slower somehow. Sleepier. Wonderful again. Because exhaustion arriving during a blizzard usually meant terrible decisions followed. Her father used to say cold fooled people into resting before it stole everything else. Keep moving, she whispered softly to herself. Voice small beneath roaring wind. Just keep moving. Then through white emptiness, something shifted. Movement. Dark shapes against snow. At first she thought exhaustion finally won. But no. Lantern light flickered faintly through the storm ahead. Horses. Large ones. Shadows moving steadily through impossible weather. A carriage convoy. Relief hit so hard it nearly hurt. Clara stumbled forward immediately, boots sinking deep into fresh snow. Wait, she tried shouting. Wind swallowed the sound instantly. Of course it did. She waved one arm desperately while fighting another burst of freezing wind that nearly knocked her sideways. The convoy moved slowly but steadily, enormous dark carriages pushing through snow with guarded precision. Royal maybe. Wealthy certainly. She could not tell much beyond lanterns and dark silhouettes through heavy weather. But shelter meant warmth. Warmth meant survival. Thinking stopped becoming complicated after that. Clara moved faster despite aching legs. One step. Another. Slipping twice. Catching herself against snowbanks before finally reaching the rear side of the procession. A smaller carriage slowed briefly near rough terrain. Door partially unlatched. Maybe someone forgot. Maybe luck finally remembered her existence. Wonderful impossible luck. She did not think. Thinking required energy she no longer possessed. Fingers shaking violently, Clara climbed the narrow step and pulled herself inside just before another wave of wind screamed past hard enough to shake the entire carriage. Warmth hit first. Soft. Immediate. Like stepping into another world entirely. Firelight flickered somewhere nearby. Thick blankets rested against dark leather seating. The smell of cedarwood and smoke settled through the space. Clara exhaled sharply, almost dizzy from relief. "I am so sorry," she started breathlessly, brushing snow from frozen sleeves. "I just needed somewhere warm for a few." Then the carriage shifted softly. Not empty. Someone sat directly across from her. Still. Silent. Watching. Dark coat. Broad shoulders. Silver eyes reflecting low lantern light with unsettling calm. The kind of calm powerful people carried because fear belonged to everyone else. Clara froze completely. Every thought vanished. Because sitting no more than 6 feet away, silent as snowfall itself, was the last person any ordinary Omega should ever accidentally climb into a carriage with. King Alpha Adrian Blackwood. Clara Whitmore forgot how to breathe. Not dramatically. Not poetically. Her lungs simply stopped cooperating for one impossible second while snow melted slowly from the edge of her sleeves onto expensive carriage flooring she absolutely should not be standing on. Wonderful. Because apparently surviving a blizzard now included accidentally trespassing inside the personal carriage of the Alpha King. Adrian Blackwood said nothing. That somehow made everything worse. He simply sat there beneath soft lantern light, broad shoulders still beneath a dark wool coat lined with black fur, silver eyes resting on her with unreadable calm. No anger exactly. No surprise either. Just observation. Like he had already measured the entire situation before she even finished panicking. Clara stepped backward instinctively. Or tried to. The carriage shifted suddenly over uneven road and her boots slipped slightly against polished flooring. Embarrassing, honestly. "I am sorry," she said quickly, words stumbling out faster than dignity could stop them. "I did not know this carriage belonged to anyone important. I only needed somewhere warm for a few minutes. I can leave." Brilliant idea. Except the moment she said leave, cold reality crashed back hard enough to settle deep into bone. Outside, wind screamed violently against carriage walls. Snow struck the windows in heavy waves. Even standing near the door now made her skin ache from remembered cold. Adrian remained quiet another second before finally speaking. His voice landed low and steady, calm enough to somehow make the storm outside sound louder. "You walked through this weather alone?" Not accusation exactly. Worse somehow. Genuine question. Clara swallowed once. "I was heading back from Briar Hollow," she answered quietly. The storm came faster than expected. Silver eyes moved briefly over her appearance then. Frozen gloves. Wet boots. Coat too thin for mountain weather. Exhaustion written plainly across pale skin. Clara suddenly felt painfully aware of every poor detail. Of course he noticed. Kings probably noticed weaknesses automatically. Somewhere outside, horses shifted restlessly. Then suddenly the carriage door jerked open. Cold wind burst inside hard enough to sting exposed skin. A royal guard appeared immediately, face tense from weather. "Your Majesty," the man started quickly before noticing Clara fully. Silence hit. Immediate terrible silence. His expression shifted so fast it almost impressed her. Confusion. Disbelief. Mild horror. Who is this? Wonderful question, honestly. Clara wished desperately to disappear before answers arrived. The guard stepped halfway inside. "Miss," he said sharply. "You cannot be here." Fair. Accurate, honestly. Clara nodded immediately, fingers already reaching for the door latch despite fear crawling painfully back through tired muscles. "I know," she answered softly. "I was leaving." Another violent burst of wind rushed through the opening, carrying snow so cold it almost burned. The mountain road outside had disappeared entirely now beneath endless white. Visibility looked terrible. Maybe 20 feet at best. Yet Clara still stepped toward the door anyway. Better embarrassment than causing trouble for someone like him. Omega girls did not accidentally sit across from Alpha Kings and expect kindness afterward. That was not how Thornwood Pack worked. The guard reached toward her coat sleeve, clearly ready to help move things along. Then Adrian finally moved. Barely. One hand lifting from the armrest with quiet certainty. Stop. Just one word. Calm. Controlled. Yet somehow enough to freeze the entire carriage instantly. Even the guard straightened. Adrian looked toward the open door briefly, snow blowing violently beyond it, before his attention returned to Clara. Sit down, he said evenly. Clara blinked once. Surely she heard wrong. The guard looked equally confused. Your Majesty? Adrian did not raise his voice. Did not repeat himself impatiently. Somehow worse. Close the door, he said calmly. Nobody leaves. The guard hesitated half a second too long before obeying immediately. The heavy door slammed shut. Silence settled again. Warmth slowly pushed back against cold. But now something stranger settled too. Confusion. Sharp, uncomfortable confusion. Clara stood frozen beside the seat, fingers trembling slightly from cold and uncertainty. Because somehow, against all logic, the Alpha King had just stopped her from stepping back into a storm that probably wanted her dead. Before we continue, if stories full of mystery, survival, and impossible destinies pull you in, do not forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next unforgettable journey. Now, somehow, Clara Whitmore found herself trapped inside a warm carriage with the most feared man in Thornwood Pack, and the storm outside showed no sign of ending. Nobody leaves. The words stayed inside the carriage longer than they should have. Heavy somehow. Quietly final. Clara Whitmore remained standing near the door for one deeply uncomfortable second, frozen between confusion and instinct. Instinct said leave. Pride said apologize again and disappear before causing trouble. Survival, however, stood awkwardly in the corner reminding her she could barely feel 2 fingers and probably would not make it another mile outside. Wonderful. Apparently dignity and freezing to death arrived together now. The royal guard hesitated beside the closed carriage door, clearly uncertain whether confusion qualified as disobedience. Your Majesty, he tried carefully, lowering his voice, the weather is worsening. We should keep moving. Adrian Blackwood did not immediately answer. He simply sat there beneath flickering lantern light, gaze shifting once toward the frost-covered window where wine struck hard enough to rattle wood. Then silver eyes moved back to Clara. Calm. Unreadable. Like whatever decision he made happened long before anyone else realized a choice existed. Then keep moving, he said evenly. And close the outer latch. The guard nodded quickly. No argument. No hesitation now. Within seconds came the heavy sound of metal locking from outside before footsteps disappeared beneath roaring snow. Silence settled again. Warm silence. Strange silence. Clara hated it immediately. Because now the reality of things stood painfully clear. She was trapped inside a royal carriage with the Alpha King of Thornwood Pack. Wonderful impossible disaster. Clara cleared her throat quietly. I really do not want to cause problems, she said softly after a moment. Honest words. Important ones. If someone sees me in here, she stopped. Fair honestly. Everyone knew how stories traveled. Especially about Omegas accidentally ending up where they should not. Adrian leaned back slightly against dark leather seating. The storm already caused problems, he replied calmly. You merely survived them. That somehow made things worse. Or better. Clara could not tell. Nobody important ever spoke to her like survival mattered. She finally lowered herself carefully onto the edge of the seat nearest the door. Not comfortably. Just enough to stop legs from trembling quite so obviously. Wet boots rested awkwardly against polished flooring while melting snow slowly gathered beneath them. Embarrassing honestly. This carriage probably cost more than everything she owned combined. Heat drifted quietly through the small space from an iron warming box near the floor. Real warmth. Dangerous warmth. The kind that made exhausted people suddenly aware of exactly how cold they had been before. Clara's fingers started aching almost immediately as feeling returned. Sharp little stings climbing through frozen skin. She tucked shaking hands into her sleeves, hoping he would not notice. Of course he noticed. Kings noticed things. Adrian reached toward the small side compartment near him without ceremony. He pulled out a folded blanket made from dark heavy wool and placed it across the empty space between them. Not handed to her exactly. Just placed there. Like choice still belonged to her. Take it, he said simply. Clara blinked once. Oh. Helpful response honestly. I could not. You are shaking. Wonderful. Straight to humiliation apparently. Clara looked down immediately. Hard to argue with visible evidence. She hesitated anyway before carefully reaching for the blanket. Warm. Thick. Heavy enough to feel expensive. She wrapped it slowly around frozen shoulders and nearly sighed out loud from relief before catching herself. Dangerous moment honestly. Comfort had a way of making people emotional when exhausted. Outside, snow battered the carriage harder now. Wind howled through mountain trees somewhere beyond visibility. Wheels shifted roughly over hidden ice. Clara swallowed quietly. How much farther until the capital? She asked after a moment. Adrian glanced briefly toward the storm outside. If weather improves, 4 hours. Small pause. If not, longer. Wonderful again. 4 hours trapped inside terrifying royal silence. Perfect. Somewhere beyond the carriage came muffled shouting between guards fighting weather conditions. Horses shifted uneasily. Then suddenly the carriage jolted hard enough to make Clara slide sideways slightly. Before embarrassment fully arrived, a steady hand caught the edge of the seat nearest her. Not touching exactly. Just stopping impact. Adrian withdrew immediately after. Careful, he said calmly. Clara nodded once too quickly. Sorry. Why did apologies keep happening? Exhaustion maybe. Fear definitely. Silence stretched again after that. Long enough for Clara to notice details she missed before. Book stacked neatly near one corner. A folded map beside untouched tea gone cold. Dark gloves resting carefully near Adrian's side. Small things. Ordinary things. Strange honestly. Kings and stories never looked ordinary. They stood taller somehow. Colder. Larger than life. Yet right now, Adrian Blackwood looked mostly tired. Controlled still. Dangerous probably. But tired beneath it. Like responsibility sat too heavily for proper rest. Then suddenly his voice broke quiet again. Why were you alone? Clara looked up quickly. I was helping someone sick, she answered softly. Mrs. Bennet in Briar Hollow. Silver eyes held there briefly. Measuring truth maybe. And nobody thought to escort you home? Clara almost laughed. Almost. People like me usually walk. The answer landed strangely between them. Adrian said nothing immediately. Yet something unreadable shifted behind silver eyes before his attention returned briefly toward the storm outside, where snow still swallowed everything foolish enough to travel alone. People like me usually walk. The words lingered strangely inside the carriage after Clara Whitmore said them. Quiet. Honest. Simple enough to sound ordinary. Yet somehow, in the warm lantern glow between endless miles of storm, they carried more weight than expected. Adrian Blackwood said nothing immediately. His expression barely shifted at all, though something subtle changed behind silver eyes. Not pity. Clara would have hated pity. Something quieter. Thoughtful maybe. Outside, wind struck the carriage again with enough force to shake the walls. Snow scraped violently against windows like winter itself wanted inside. The horses slowed briefly somewhere ahead before continuing forward. Progress felt uncertain now. Dangerous even. Clara adjusted the heavy blanket around herself more tightly, suddenly aware of how tired she actually felt. Exhaustion sat everywhere now. In aching muscles. In frozen fingertips slowly returning to painful life. In heavy eyelids threatening betrayal every few minutes. Wonderful. Because falling asleep inside the Alpha King's carriage definitely sounded like a new level of humiliation. She sat straighter immediately. Adrian noticed. Of course he noticed. You should rest, he said calmly. Clara nearly laughed from nervousness. I do not think sleeping here would be appropriate. Fair honestly. Omega girls accidentally climbing into royal carriages usually aimed for invisible, not comfortable. Adrian glanced once toward the storm outside before answering. Appropriate stopped mattering when you climbed into a blizzard half frozen. That landed harder than expected. Not cruel. Not mocking. Just strangely factual. Clara looked down instead of answering. Somewhere deep beneath embarrassment sat another uncomfortable feeling. Relief maybe. Dangerous thing honestly. Relief made people softer than survival usually allowed. The carriage jolted hard again. Strong enough this time to make teacups shift slightly across the table between them. Outside came muffled shouting from guards battling worsening weather. Then suddenly everything stopped. Complete stop. No movement. No wheels. No horses pushing forward. Silence arrived too quickly. Wrong silence. Adrian turned his head slightly toward the door. Immediate attention sharpening his expression. A knock sounded moments later before the door opened just enough for cold air to rush inside. The same royal guard appeared again, snow gathering thickly against shoulders now. Your Majesty, he said carefully, voice tense. The northern pass is closing. Visibility dropped again. We may need to stop until conditions improve. Wonderful. Apparently freezing to death remained committed to the schedule. Adrian stood for the first time since Clara entered the carriage. Tall enough somehow to make the small space feel suddenly smaller. Broader too. Kings should not physically change rooms by standing still, and yet somehow he did. How long? Adrian asked evenly. Hard to say, the guard admitted. Could be 1 hour. Could be until morning. Clara tried very hard not to react visibly to the phrase until morning. Failed slightly. Because apparently fate decided accidental proximity deserved expansion. Adrian noticed the panic immediately. Of course he did. Find shelter near the ridge, he instructed calmly. No unnecessary risks. The guard nodded once and disappeared back into storm. Door shut. Lock secured again. Warmth returned slowly. Clara stared at the window where snow moved endlessly through darkness. Until morning, she asked quietly before stopping herself. Wonderful. Calm voice completely abandoned her apparently. Adrian sat back down across from her without visible concern. Only if weather worsens. Helpful. Terrifyingly unhelpful. Clara folded shaking hands together beneath the blanket. I should not stay here that long. Honest concern. Real concern. People will talk. There. Finally said aloud. Thornwood Pack survived on stories and suspicion. An unmarried Omega trapped overnight near the Alpha King? Wonderful social disaster waiting patiently at the end of survival. Adrian looked at her steadily for 1 second too long. People already talk, he said eventually. Snow does not care about reputation. Clara blinked once. Hard to argue with that honestly. Yet worry remained anyway. She shifted awkwardly against the seat. Still, she started softly. Adrian interrupted quietly this time. Not rude. Just certain. You are not stepping outside. Final tone. Not cruel. Not negotiable either. Silence stretched again afterward. Longer this time. Stranger. Clara studied details instead of looking directly at him. The neat organization of papers beside him. A silver watch resting near untouched tea. One book slightly worn at the corners like somebody actually read it instead of displaying importance. Strange honestly. None of this matched rumors. Rumors described Adrian Blackwood differently. Colder. Untouchable. Brutal sometimes. Yet so far, the terrifying Alpha King mostly offered blankets and refused to let her freeze to death. Confusing behavior honestly. Then, unexpectedly, Adrian reached again toward the side compartment and pulled out a small wrapped package. Bread. Dried fruit. Simple travel food. He placed it quietly between them. Eat, he said. Clara stared briefly. I am fine. Her stomach betrayed her instantly. Loudly. Wonderful. Complete betrayal. Adrian said absolutely nothing. Somehow worse than teasing. Clara felt heat rise painfully into cold cheeks. Finally, awkwardly, she reached for the bread. Thank you, she said quietly. Silver eyes shifted toward the storm again before he answered in a voice calm enough to almost disappear beneath the sound of snow. You should save gratitude, he said softly. The night is not finished yet. The night is not finished yet. Somehow, those words stayed with Clara Whitmore longer than they should have. Quiet words. Calm words. Yet spoken in a way that sounded less like warning and more like certainty. Outside, the storm had grown louder. Wind battered the carriage walls hard enough to rattle lantern chains overhead while snow moved endlessly across frosted windows and thick white waves. Whatever road existed outside no longer looked real. Just darkness and winter swallowing everything beyond sight. Clara sat wrapped tightly in the heavy blanket, fingers finally warm enough to stop aching quite so badly. The bread sat lighter in her stomach than expected, though exhaustion still lingered everywhere. Sleep pressed gently at the edges of thought now. Dangerous honestly. Because falling asleep inside the Alpha King's carriage still felt entirely unacceptable. Even if he had technically saved her life. Maybe. Probably. Wonderful complicated situation. Across from her, Adrian Blackwood had returned to quiet again. One arm rested against the side of the seat while unreadable silver eyes occasionally shifted toward maps spread loosely beside him. Yet every few minutes, whether intentional or not, Clara noticed his attention briefly move toward the frost gathering near the edges of her coat sleeves. Like he still checked whether she remained conscious. Strange honestly. Nobody usually noticed things like that. Especially not kings. Another hard jolt shook the carriage. Stronger than before. Clara caught herself quickly against the edge of the seat while somewhere outside horses shifted uneasily. Then came shouting again. Muffled this time beneath weather. Too distant to understand. Adrian stood immediately. Fast enough to feel practiced. Calm enough to feel routine. He opened the side window slightly, cold air rushing inside sharp enough to sting. A guard rode close beside them, snow nearly covering shoulders now. Visibility is gone, the man called over roaring wind. We found shelter near the ridge. Small hunting station. Adrian nodded once. Get everyone inside. It is small, the guard warned. Not enough space for the full convoy. Small pause. You may need to remain in the carriage. Wonderful. Trapped together extended apparently. Adrian closed the window again without visible concern. We stop here then, he said simply. The carriage slowed gradually after that. Wheels crunching deeper into packed snow until finally everything settled into stillness. No movement now. Only wind screaming through mountain trees somewhere nearby. Clara looked toward the frosted window uncertainly. Are we stuck? Helpful question honestly. Adrian glanced briefly toward her. Temporarily. Not reassuring. Somehow worse because calm people always sounded terrifying during disasters. Moments later came another knock before the carriage door opened briefly. A servant entered carrying a small iron kettle and extra firewood for the warming box near the floor. He froze immediately after noticing Clara again. Wonderful. Apparently surprise remained the official reaction tonight. Yet unlike the guard earlier, this man wisely said absolutely nothing. Smart honestly. Adrian spoke without looking up. Bring another blanket. The servant blinked once. Yes, Your Majesty. Gone again moments later. Clara shifted awkwardly beneath the first blanket. You really do not have to keep doing that. Adrian looked up from the map finally. Doing what? Dangerous question. Helping, she answered quietly. Honest word. Strange word. You do not even know me. Silver eyes rested on her longer than usual before shifting briefly toward the storm outside. I know enough, he said eventually. Clara frowned slightly despite herself. Enough for what? Small silence followed. Then Adrian answered quietly. Enough to know you should not have been walking alone in weather like this. Fair criticism honestly. Yet embarrassment still settled deep beneath ribs anyway. I did not have much choice, Clara admitted softly. Mrs. Bennet needed medicine. Nobody else would go. Adrian said nothing immediately. Something unreadable shifted again behind his expression. Not approval exactly. Not surprise either. Thoughtful maybe. Then quietly, and you still went. Clara shrugged once beneath the blanket. People need help sometimes. Strange thing happened then. Very small thing. Adrian looked away too quickly. Like something about the answer landed somewhere unexpected. Before silence could settle fully again, the servant returned with another blanket and fresh tea. Steam curled softly through the carriage, warm and faintly sweet. Adrian motioned once toward the second cup. Drink. Clara hesitated automatically. I should not take yours. I asked for another. Wonderful again. Apparently arguing survival became exhausting quickly. She accepted carefully this time, hands wrapping around warmth she probably needed more than pride. Outside, wind howled harder against the carriage. Somewhere in the distance came the sound of shifting snow falling deeper through mountain trees. The hunting station lantern flickered faintly through frost-covered glass nearby. Safe enough for now maybe. Yet strangely, sitting inside this warm space no longer felt quite as terrifying as before. Confusing honestly. Because somehow the Alpha King who everyone whispered about in frightened voices had spent the last hour making sure she stayed warm, fed, and alive. And Clara Whitmore no longer knew exactly what to fear more. The storm outside, or the growing realization that she might have misunderstood the man sitting across from her entirely. Sometimes danger does not arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as warmth after survival. Clara Whitmore realized that sometime after midnight, while snow continued swallowing the world outside and exhaustion finally stopped pretending it would wait politely. The hunting station lantern beyond the frosted carriage window flickered weakly through blowing snow, barely visible now beneath layers of ice gathering against the glass. Whatever safety existed outside remained temporary at best. Inside, warmth held steady. Soft crackling from the small iron heater near the floor mixed with distant wind until silence became strangely comfortable. Dangerous honestly. Comfortable things invited trust. Trust invited mistakes. Especially around men powerful enough to ruin lives without trying. Yet Adrian Blackwood had done nothing except make certain she stayed alive. Confusing problem honestly. Clara adjusted the blanket tighter around herself, fingers curled loosely around the empty teacup now resting carefully beside her. Warmth had reached her hands fully at last, though exhaustion still settled everywhere else. Her shoulders ached. Legs felt heavy. Thoughts moved slower. Across from her, Adrian sat near the lantern glow reviewing papers that somehow still mattered during a mountain storm. Calm. Unshaken. Like blizzards merely interrupted schedules rather than threatened survival. Clara tried not to stare. Failed occasionally. Wonderful. Because apparently curiosity survived freezing temperatures. Rumors had built Adrian Blackwood into something larger than ordinary people. A cold ruler. Ruthless when necessary. Distant always. The kind of alpha children lowered voices around. Yet the man sitting across from her had spent hours quietly making sure she ate, drank, and stayed warm enough not to collapse. Neither version matched properly anymore. The carriage shifted slightly beneath another wave of heavy wind. Clara glanced automatically toward the window. Darkness. Endless white moving through darkness. Strange how quickly storms erased roads. Whole worlds disappeared beneath weather sometimes. You should sleep. Adrian's voice arrived quietly enough to almost disappear into the sound of snowfall. Clara looked up too fast. I am fine. Immediate lie honestly. Adrian glanced once toward her tired expression before returning attention briefly to the papers. You nearly fell asleep holding tea. Wonderful betrayal from her own face apparently. Clara looked away immediately. I did not want to be rude. Small pause. Honest pause. Or uncomfortable. Adrian set the papers aside completely this time. You survived a blizzard, he said evenly. I think sleeping qualifies as acceptable. Somehow the corner of Clara's mouth almost moved. Almost. Dangerous moment honestly. Humor around terrifying kings probably led somewhere unfortunate. Still feels strange, she admitted quietly. Being here. Adrian leaned back slightly, gaze steady without pressure. Because of me? Straightforward question. Too straightforward honestly. Clara hesitated. Fair answer probably involved honesty. Terrifying honesty. Because of everything, she said softly. Kings usually do not let strangers into their carriage. Silver eyes shifted briefly toward frost gathering near the window. You were not invited, he said calmly. You climbed inside. Clara blinked once. Then, despite herself, laughed softly under her breath. Small sound. Quiet enough to disappear quickly. Yet somehow the carriage felt different afterward. Less tense maybe. Adrian watched her for 1 second longer than usual before looking away first. Strange honestly. Somewhere outside came muffled footsteps moving quickly through snow. A knock sounded lightly against the carriage door. Adrian opened it halfway. One guard stood outside wrapped heavily against cold. Storm worsened again, the man reported. Pass completely blocked now. We cannot leave before daylight. Wonderful. Apparently accidental overnight disaster officially confirmed. Adrian nodded once. Understood. The guard hesitated briefly, eyes flicking unintentionally toward Clara again before lowering respectfully. Gone moments later. Door closed. Lock secured once more. Clara stared quietly at the floor. Morning. She would still be here by morning. Inside the Alpha King's carriage. With witnesses. With rumors waiting patiently somewhere in the future like unpaid debts. You are worried, Adrian said after a moment. Not question. Observation. Clara sighed softly. People talk. Honest answer remained stubborn apparently. Especially about Omega women. Silence stretched briefly. Then Adrian spoke in that same calm voice somehow capable of sounding final without effort. Then let them talk. Clara looked up immediately. Easy for kings to say honestly. Reputation landed differently depending who carried power. Yet before worry settled too deeply again, Adrian stood and reached toward a storage cabinet near the back of the carriage. He pulled free another folded blanket before setting it carefully beside her seat. Lie down, he said simply. Clara blinked once. Here? Unless you prefer freezing outside. Fair argument honestly. Hard to defeat logic delivered that directly. She hesitated anyway before carefully shifting sideways against the long cushioned seat. Blanket wrapped close. Boots still on because dignity remained somewhere alive. Lantern light moved softly across dark wood overhead while storm winds continued their endless argument outside. Exhaustion finally won quietly after that. Yet just before sleep fully reached her, Clara noticed something strange. Adrian had moved the heater slightly closer to her side of the carriage. Small thing. Thoughtful thing. Like warmth had become his responsibility somehow. Confusing realization honestly. Because for the first time all night, Clara Whitmore no longer felt trapped inside a carriage with the most feared man in Thornwood Pack. Somehow, impossibly, she felt safe. Morning arrived slowly, though nobody inside the carriage would have called it morning if not for the faint silver light finally pressing weakly through frost-covered windows. The storm had quieted sometime before sunrise. Not ended exactly. Just softened enough to sound tired instead of furious. Clara Whitmore woke slowly beneath heavy blankets, warmth still wrapped gently around aching muscles. For one peaceful second she forgot where she was. Then reality returned all at once. The royal carriage. The mountain ridge. The Alpha King. Wonderful. Panic arrived politely right afterward. Clara sat upright too quickly, blanket slipping from one shoulder while sleep disappeared entirely. Across from her, Adrian Blackwood already sat awake. Of course he did. Somehow he looked exactly the same as the night before. Calm. Controlled. Impossible to imagine he had slept at all. A fresh cup of tea rested beside him while quiet morning light softened the sharp lines of his face just enough to make him seem unexpectedly human. Dangerous observation honestly. Clara straightened immediately. I am sorry, she said quickly, because apparently apologies remained her survival strategy now. I did not mean to fall asleep. Adrian glanced briefly up from the papers in his hand. You needed sleep. Simple answer. No judgment. Somehow worse. Clara looked toward the window instead. Outside, snow still covered everything in impossible amounts. The hunting station stood barely visible beneath white drifts while royal guards moved carefully between horses, preparing supplies for departure. Smoke rose weakly from somewhere nearby. Morning activity already started. Which meant people definitely noticed she spent the night here. Wonderful disaster officially alive. Clara adjusted her coat quietly. The convoy will leave soon? Adrian nodded once. If the pass clears enough. Small pause. Another hour. Another hour trapped inside consequences. Perfect. Before awkward silence could settle completely, a knock sounded against the door. Adrian opened it halfway. One older servant entered carrying breakfast trays and fresh firewood for the heater. Bread. Warm oatmeal. Tea again. The servant placed everything carefully before pausing just long enough to glance at Clara. Not judgment exactly. Worse somehow. Curiosity. Quiet royal curiosity already building stories before breakfast. Wonderful. Yet strangely, the man only bowed politely. Miss Whitmore, he said respectfully before leaving. Clara froze completely. He knows my name? Adrian looked unsurprised. He asked. Helpful answer. Terrifying answer honestly. People will think, Clara stopped herself. No point finishing. Adrian understood anyway. Silver eyes lifted calmly toward her. People think many things. Clara exhaled quietly. Easy for kings. Harder for women whose entire reputation could change from one misunderstanding. She looked down at untouched breakfast instead. You do not understand, she admitted softly. Honest words again. Dangerous habit around powerful men. An Omega spending the night near someone like you, she hesitated. People make assumptions. Adrian said nothing immediately. Outside, snow slipped quietly from carriage rooftops while distant horses shifted against cold air. Finally he set the papers aside. Then they are wrong. Clara looked up too quickly. Calm certainty again. Like rumors simply stopped mattering because he said so. Wonderful impossible confidence. That does not stop gossip, she answered quietly. Adrian leaned back slightly, gaze steady without sharpness. No, he admitted calmly. But it stops consequences. Strange sentence. Heavy sentence. Clara frowned faintly. Before she could ask what that meant, another knock interrupted them. This time one younger guard opened the door, visibly hesitant. Your Majesty, he started carefully, the road should clear enough within 30 minutes. Small pause. Council members in the capital expect your arrival by afternoon. Adrian nodded once. Prepare the convoy. The guard hesitated strangely before adding, and arrangements for the guest? Guest. Clara nearly looked behind herself to check who he meant. Adrian answered before confusion fully arrived. She stays with the convoy. Clara blinked once. Hard. Surely she misunderstood. The guard looked equally surprised for half a second before quickly nodding. Yes, Your Majesty. Gone moments later. Silence followed immediately. Clara stared openly now. I cannot go to the capital with you. Honest panic this time. Real panic. I have work. And people waiting. Adrian reached for his tea calmly, like impossible statements happened every morning. Roads remain dangerous. Still, Clara said softly, trying very hard not to sound overwhelmed. I should go home. Silver eyes rested on her for one quiet second before moving toward the frost-covered window. You nearly froze yesterday, he said evenly. I prefer not repeating mistakes. Strange thing happened then. Very small thing. Clara realized he said prefer like her survival somehow personally mattered. Dangerous realization honestly. Outside, sunlight finally touched the edge of snow-covered mountains, pale gold slipping carefully across endless white. The storm had passed. Roads waited again. Normal life should have felt close now. Yet somehow, sitting inside this warm carriage, Clara Whitmore suddenly had the uncomfortable feeling that nothing about her life would return to normal after this morning. Nothing changes faster than certainty. One day, a road feels familiar. The next, one wrong turn inside a storm changes everything. Clara Whitmore sat quietly beneath the fading warmth of the carriage while morning stretched slowly across the frozen mountain ridge. Outside, servants moved faster now. Horses were being prepared. Wheels checked. Snow brushed carefully from leather straps while guards spoke in low voices sharp enough to sound important. Departure felt close. Real enough to settle nervous weight quietly inside her chest. She still had not fully understood what Adrian Blackwood meant earlier. She stays with the convoy. Simple sentence. Impossible sentence. Dangerous sentence. Clara folded trembling fingers together beneath the blanket, though cold no longer caused the shaking now. I cannot go all the way to the capital, she said again softly after several long minutes. Not dramatic. Just honest. People at home will worry. Adrian stood near the frosted window now, dark coat resting perfectly against broad shoulders while pale winter sunlight softened silver eyes just enough to steal some of their distance. He looked impossibly calm for someone whose entire morning apparently included changing another person's life without warning. Someone expecting you? He asked quietly. Clara hesitated. Strange question honestly. Not exactly. Her parents had passed years ago. Friends existed, certainly. Familiar faces. Village people who waved politely. But nobody waiting by windows counting hours. Nobody checking roads in storms. Mrs. Bennet probably worries, Clara admitted eventually. She always worries. Something unreadable flickered briefly across Adrian's expression before disappearing again. Then someone should tell her you survived. Such an ordinary sentence. Yet somehow hearing survived spoken out loud settled strangely inside her. Because she almost had not. That uncomfortable truth finally arrived fully now that danger had passed. Yesterday, had the convoy appeared even 20 minutes later, she might still be out there somewhere beneath endless snow. Quiet realization, honestly. Heavy one too. A knock interrupted the silence. The younger guard from earlier stepped inside carefully, carrying folded maps and fresh weather updates. "Road is clear enough, Your Majesty," he said. "We can leave immediately if necessary." Small pause. "Though southern turns remain unstable." Adrian nodded once. "We leave in 10 minutes. The guard hesitated again before lowering his voice slightly. "And Miss Whitmore?" Clara hated how strange hearing her own name sounded now. Adrian answered without hesitation. "She rides here." Final tone again. No room for confusion. The guard nodded quickly before disappearing back outside. Clara stared openly this time. "You keep deciding things for me." The words escaped softer than intended. "Honest. Nervous." Adrian turned toward her fully for the first time that morning. No anger. No offense. Just quiet attention. "You are free to leave," he said evenly. Clara blinked once. "Wait. That sounded different." "But," she asked carefully. Adrian stepped slightly closer to the window, gaze briefly shifting toward snow-packed roads outside. "But I think it would be foolish." There it was. Calm honesty again. Wonderful frustrating honesty. Clara looked down instead. Hard to argue with someone who technically prevented freezing to death. "You locked the carriage," she said quietly after a moment. Strange thing to bring up suddenly. Yet it had stayed with her all night. The memory of that sound. Metal securing behind her. "Nobody leaves." Adrian said nothing immediately. Wind moved softly outside now, no longer angry enough to sound dangerous. Just cold. Familiar cold. Finally he answered. "Yes." Clara frowned slightly. "Why?" Small word. Big question. Honest question. Because somewhere between tea, blankets, and quiet conversations, confusion had grown larger than fear. Adrian looked toward the frost-lined glass instead of her at first. Long enough to almost seem like he would not answer. Then quietly, calmly, like truth belonged nowhere else, he said, "Because if you stepped back outside yesterday, you would not have survived." Silence settled hard after that. Not dramatic silence. Real silence. Quiet enough for Clara to hear distant horses shifting beneath leather harnesses outside. Her chest tightened unexpectedly. Because suddenly the memory arrived differently now. The open carriage door. Snow moving sideways through wind. Her frozen hands. Legs barely steady. She had been ready to leave anyway. Pride. Embarrassment. Rules. Omega girls knew where they belonged. Not inside royal carriages. Yet Adrian had locked the door. Not to trap her. Not to frighten her. To keep her alive. Wonderful impossible realization. Clara looked up slowly. "You knew?" she asked quietly. Adrian met her gaze this time. Steady. Honest. "I know winter in these mountains." Small pause. "And I know what cold does when people wait too long." Something changed then. Very small thing. Yet impossible to ignore. For the first time since climbing inside that carriage, Clara saw something behind the reputation. Not coldness exactly. Not power either. Something quieter. Tired maybe. Familiar with loss in ways people rarely spoke about. Outside, voices rose softly as the convoy prepared to move. The storm had ended. Roads waited again. Yet somehow Clara Whitmore suddenly understood something strange. The moment Adrian Blackwood locked that carriage door, he had not imprisoned her. He had chosen her survival over every rule Thornwood Pack expected him to follow. Sometimes the truth changes everything. Sometimes it changes nothing at all except the way a person looks at someone they thought they understood. Clara Whitmore sat quietly for several long seconds after Adrian Blackwood spoke, hands folded tightly together beneath the heavy blanket while morning light continued slipping softly across frozen windows. Because suddenly, painfully, embarrassingly, everything from yesterday looked different now. The locked carriage door. The quiet command. Nobody leaves. She had thought control. Fear. Power. But the truth sat simpler than that. Survival. He had seen danger she was too cold and exhausted to understand herself. Outside, movement around the convoy grew busier now. Horses stamped against packed snow while servants loaded supplies and guards checked routes before departure. The world had resumed motion. Yet inside the carriage, silence lingered differently now. Softer somehow. Clara looked down at her hands briefly before finally speaking. I thought, she stopped herself. Wonderful. Words suddenly difficult. Adrian waited without pressure. Calm patience again. I thought you locked the carriage because I was not supposed to be there, she admitted quietly. Honest embarrassment warmed her cheeks faster than tea ever could. Most people would have made me leave. Adrian rested one arm lightly against the seat, gaze shifting briefly toward snow-covered mountains outside before returning to her. Most people do not understand winter, he answered calmly. Small pause. Or consequences. Something about the way he said consequences settled strangely inside her. Familiar maybe. Like experience sat behind the word. Clara hesitated. Someone died before. Not really question. More realization arriving slowly. Adrian grew quiet then. Not dramatic silence. Heavy silence. Honest silence. Outside, distant voices moved through morning air while snow slipped softly from carriage roofs nearby. Finally he answered in the same calm voice that somehow carried more truth when quieter. Years ago, he said. A family tried crossing these roads after dark. Silver eyes moved briefly toward the frozen mountain ridge beyond the window. They never reached shelter. Clara's chest tightened unexpectedly. No details needed. Winter already explained enough. Strange thing about grief. Sometimes people recognized it before words arrived. And suddenly, impossibly, Clara understood something else. Adrian Blackwood had not only saved her because it was practical. He had saved her because once before, somebody had not survived. Quiet realization honestly. Sad realization too. I am sorry, she said softly. This time the apology meant something different. Adrian looked toward her briefly, expression unreadable as always. Yet softer somehow around the edges. You do not owe me apologies, he said. Funny honestly. Because apologies had practically become Clara's personality over the last 24 hours. Before awkwardness settled again, the carriage shifted slightly as preparations outside neared completion. Another knock sounded. This time an older advisor stepped halfway inside wearing an expression carefully balanced between professional and deeply confused. Wonderful. More witnesses. Your Majesty, the man started carefully, eyes flicking briefly toward Clara before correcting himself immediately. The council sent word again. They expect immediate attendance after arrival. Adrian nodded once. Understood. The advisor hesitated strangely. And, brief pause. Will Miss Whitmore require arrangements upon reaching the capital? Clara nearly stopped breathing. Arrangements. Capital. Why did everyone suddenly speak like she accidentally belonged in royal plans? Adrian answered calmly, like the question had already been settled long ago. Yes. The advisor blinked once. Clearly surprised. Smart enough not to argue though. Of course, Your Majesty. Gone moments later. Door closed again. Silence returned. Clara stared openly now. You still plan on taking me with you? Not question anymore. Realization. Adrian reached calmly for his gloves near the table. Until roads are safe enough for proper travel. Helpful answer. Terrifyingly vague answer. The capital is 3 days away, Clara said softly. Adrian looked entirely unsurprised she knew that. Yes. Wonderful. Apparently accidental carriage ride officially evolved into unexpected royal travel. Clara looked toward the window again where guards now mounted horses beneath pale winter sunlight. Thornwood Capital. Palace walls. Royal Council. People who probably wore expensive coats and spoke in careful voices. People who absolutely did not accidentally climb into carriages during snowstorms. I do not belong there, she admitted quietly. Honest fear this time. Different from cold. Worse somehow. Adrian stood then, taller somehow in morning light, dark coat adjusted neatly against broad shoulders. Yet when he answered, voice calm as ever, something steadier rested beneath it. Yesterday, he said quietly, you did not belong outside either. Clara looked up immediately. Small sentence. Simple sentence. Yet somehow impossible to argue with. Outside, horses finally started moving into formation. The convoy waited. Roads reopened. Life preparing itself to move forward whether Clara understood any of it or not. Then Adrian stepped toward the carriage door before pausing briefly. Miss Whitmore, he said, voice quieter than usual. Clara looked up again. Silver eyes rested steadily on hers for one impossible second. You survived the storm. Small pause. Calm certainty again. Let us worry about the rest afterward. And strangely, for reasons Clara Whitmore still could not fully explain, hearing him say us unsettled her far more than the storm ever had.